Welcome back to the Everything is Black and White podcast. I'm Andrew Musgrove. It's time for the view from the opposition ahead of the Weird Town Derby on Sunday. And it's a pleasure to welcome back to the podcast Connor Bromley, Sunderland fan, YouTuber, and author. Connor, welcome back to the show. How are you keeping? You well?
I am well, yes. I'm very glad that you called it the We Are Tyne Derby as well. That was a turn up of the books. Normally it's Tyne We Are, but you've went We Are Tyne because Sunderland are at home, so I like that. I appreciate the respect.
You've got to get the location right. It is the Weird Town Derby. And when it comes back in a few months' time, the Town Weird Derby. And hopefully Newcastle will be looking to make it 6 points out of six. Although I'm not feeling too confident about that. But enough about me. How are you feeling about it?
I am feeling. If you'd asked me this question, sorry, if you asked me this question back in May when Tommy Watson scores the goal in the playoff fight, maybe a few days after that. I mean, I was obviously in a delirious state for a few days after we got promoted. I was worried about things like the derby because you see what newly promoted teams have done, and you panic about the fact, well, Southampton finished with 12 points last season. They came up through the playoffs, and I didn't expect Sunderland to be as aggressive in the transfer market as what we were. I didn't expect them to be able to sign players like Granit Xhaka and Ronaldo, and we did manage to bring in lots of quality players. And now we've started the season pretty well. I know we're on a run currently of 1 win in 6, which suggests that maybe we are a little bit out of form. I think you look at the context of that with the teams we've played in that time, then maybe it's not as bad as people think. But I think I'm feeling far more confident than I ever would have imagined. But that isn't to say that I'm feeling like we are definitely going to win the game or anything. I think that if if we looked at the two, I mean, if Newcastle play at their absolute best, then they should win the game, and that's what you've got to temper this whole conversation with, because Newcastle do, unfortunately, from a Sunderland perspective, have a lot of better players. But obviously, if you watch Newcastle this season, as I have, I watched them on Wednesday night. There are definitely things that Sunderland can exploit.
Certainly so. And why don't you share with our audience what you think that will be? Where do you think Sunderland will target on Sunday?
I think that there's a few things. One, Newcastle can't seem to play a complete 90 minutes. I thought on Wednesday night we see a really bad 45 minutes in the first half. We then see a pretty good period of maybe half an hour in the second half where they hit the post a couple of times, obviously scored a couple of goals, and then they concede a lot of late goals. I think conceded 7 or 8 late goals this season, dropped a lot of points late on, and that is something. That late goals is a really big thing for us because Sunderland are the team that's picked up the most points from losing positions this season. We haven't scored a goal in the first 15 minutes, but we think we've scored 8 or 9 in the last 15 minutes. We are a team that, I mean, the club motto is till the end. We are a team that fights until the end, and I just wonder if, from a Sunderland perspective, if we can keep the game at a draw heading into 75, 80 minutes, whether or not we can, you know, turn that into a win because we have that mentality. But I think as well with Newcastle, they've got, I think, a really strong central midfield area, but I think Sunderland have got a decent central midfield area as well. I look at the defence, the goalkeeper situation. I'm not 100% convinced by Ramsdale. I'm definitely not convinced by Nick Pope. And I'm not 100% convinced by the defence either. I think if Dan Burn slots in at centre back, that's a player that we can maybe target and exploit. I know he played there on Wednesday. I don't know if he'll start the game at the weekend. You'd probably think he would because obviously he's a local lad from the same place as me. Actually, I went to the same school as Dan Burn, so there we go. A couple of years above me at school. So I think we've got things like that. I think Dan Burn, if he plays, it's a scenario we can exploit. It's a bit of a shame that your fullbacks are fit, because I think your fullbacks in Lewis Hall and Tino Livramento do change how you play. And if a month ago I was watching you at Brentford and I watched you at West Ham and you were awful, but I think since them two players have come back into the team, you look a little bit stronger. But yeah, I think the thing that I'm looking at is Newcastle's mentality does not seem to be right late in games, and they do concede a lot of goals late on, and we score a lot of goals late on.
Yeah, I think that's the fear of most Newcastle United fans, that if the scoreline is level going into the final 15, 20 minutes, that when the clock runs down to about 90, Sunderland stand a chance of doing what they've done, as you've said, plenty of times this season, and grabbing a late goal. Are Sunderland favourites for this game? You talked about kind of your feeling, expectations towards this game, and how it's changed from when the fixtures were first drawn. But coming into it, I think they are just slight favourites. Do you?
Depends what way you look at it. I mean, if you look at the quality of the teams, you look at what Newcastle have and what Sunderland have, you would have Newcastle as favourites. But if you put context to it, Sunderland obviously haven't lost a game at home this season. Sunderland have got a higher in the league table than Newcastle. I think Newcastle playing a lot more games than Sunderland this season. I think we've probably played about 8 or 9 more games than Sunderland because you've done well in the Cups and you're in the Champions League. So you've got a lot more fatigue than Sunderland. Sunderland don't have a lot of injuries either. I would say that it's a pretty balanced game. I imagine most neutrals would probably have it down as a draw. I think it's going to be a draw or a 1-goal game either way. I wouldn't like to label Sunderland as favourites, but I could certainly see why somebody would think they were, especially with how we've played at home this season. But yeah, I am unwilling to be on record and say that Sunderland are favourites. But I certainly think from where we were when we got promoted, I would never expect it to have come into this game with the conversation being whether or not Sunderland were favourites for it.
I'd just say they are simply because of the reasons you explained there. And I think as well, despite Newcastle picking up a point in Germany on Wednesday, which if you'd offered Newcastle fans that before the game, they would have taken, but then to be in a winning position and to throw it away again, it does deflate you somewhat. And as we've discussed, Sunderland's strength tends to be at the end of the game. So I'm just a little bit nervous about all those aspects. And that's why I do label Sunderland just slight favourites. Connor, what does this game mean to you and to the Sunderland fan base?
I think, well, I mean, it's a derby game, isn't it? So it means a lot. I think about a lot of the positive memories I've had in derby games. I think a lot of the negative memories. I mean, the 5-1, for example. I'm at that point in high school in a Newcastle supporting area. You know, you can imagine how horrendous that was for me when the time got to 5-1 on that Monday afternoon when I was back in school. Was not good. What's the time, Connor? Yeah, it's 5-1. Yeah. So I think that it means a lot to me in the sense as well of Sunderland's journey, because when you are in League One, you know, and it wasn't that long ago me and you were having conversations, and basically you were sort of tapping Sunderland on the head being like, oh, isn't it, you know, hopefully you get out of League One, you get in the Championship and stuff. Sunderland have had a really horrible journey, a journey that most clubs of this size have not had. You know, 4 years in League One, managers like Phil Parkinson, God, we have had some absolute tripe through the door as well in terms of players. And to get up from League One at the Championship and then to get up in the way that we did last season was amazing. And it's to earn the right to play these sort of games. So it means a lot in that sense that, to be honest, I didn't know when we would have a Premier League derby game again. And I certainly didn't think it would be is in 2025, you know, when Sunderland were going through that period that they were in, sort of 2018 to 2022, where we just couldn't get out of League One. So I think it means a lot in that sense. Obviously, a derby game is a derby game, and your viewers and listeners will feel the way that it's quite an individual thing. It depends on who your friends are, who your family are. I mean, I've got split family on both sides. My close family is all Sunderland, but my brother-in-law is Newcastle. Then on my wife's side, her dad's a big Newcastle fan, but her brother is Sunderland and all his side Sunderland. All my cousins and whatnot are pretty much all Newcastle. So I've got a lot of it within my family, and it's a very, very split thing. So it means a lot to me just that over Christmas, because the game is so close to Christmas, that when I see people, it would be nice not to have the mick taken out of us when I have Christmas dinner. So that's the main thing for me. But yeah, it's a derby game. It means a lot of people. I've seen quite a bit of downplaying, I think, from the Newcastle side. I feel like on social media I've seen that quite a bit, where it's the third most important game of the week's been a thing banded about, which is fine if people think that, but I think that that's people maybe manifesting, you know, they don't want they want, if Sunderland were to win, to be like, well, it wasn't even our most important game. That's how it feels like to me. But I think a derby is a derby, and it is, for whatever people say, your home derby is one of the most important games of the season. Certainly you look for it when the fixtures come out. It's the first game you look for when that happens.
Yeah, I don't think many Newcastle United fans actually believe that it's the third most important game of this week. This is the derby. You don't want to lose it. You cannot lose it. It's unthinkable to lose it. And it is funny you mentioned that kind of emotional kind of battle between sides of families and group of friends. My best friend is a Sunderland fan, and we've been having this kind of back and forth about the game. And I remember that FA Cup derby a couple of years back. I met him on the concourse just before kick-off. We had a bit of a chat about the game. Then he walked away, and then he whistled to us, and I turned around just to look at him, and he just put 7 fingers up, which was a very bad mistake by him, because obviously it was went the other way. But it's those kind of like funny moments. And now, you know, I think he's feeling more confident than I am. But obviously, you just want to get through it, and then you'll deal with the fallout at full time. We've mentioned there one of Sunderland's strengths is to just keep going right until the death. Anything else to look out for?
In terms of what Sunderland are, we are a pretty aggressive team. We are very physical. If you watch, I don't know how many games you've watched of Sunderland this season, but if you watched us say play Arsenal at home, we did a really good job of bullying them physically, and that is one of the most physical teams. But we're dominant aerially, and we are very very good at doing the basics in football, and that's how I would describe this team. We are not a flashy team. We are not a team that is gonna really cut you open and slice through you, but we are a team that does all the basics you need to do in football very, very well. We're very, very well organised. And yeah, I would expect, if I was a Newcastle fan, to play us and just expect a lot of commitment, a lot of aggressive play, a lot of organisation. We don't let teams get into the middle of the pitch. That's another big strength of ours. One of the reasons why we've done so well this season is that we literally, I don't know how they do it, but they box out the box. It's very difficult for teams to play through into the box, and we've conceded quite a few long range goals because of that, because we are so protective of that area. It sort of is what it is. When Ruben Diaz, who scored like 3 goals in his career, pings one in from 35 yards at the weekend, you don't expect that to happen, but it can happen in the Premier League. But yeah, we are just defensively pretty strong. We've got good foundations, and our manager is quite good at making changes in games as well. I mean, if you think about the Chelsea away win we had, it comes from his substitutions. Talby scores, who comes on, Brobby comes on and holds the ball up, gets the assist. So we are quite good in that sense as well. So I think I would just expect a team that's pretty... we do the fundamentals correctly, and we can lose a game because sometimes teams have better quality players, but we are a team that, can... I wouldn't expect us to be making crazy decisions on the pitch. It's probably the best way of putting it. We are a team that is going to do the basics correctly.
Just a reminder, ladies and gents, that this episode is sponsored by NordVPN. You can click the link in the podcast description box to get a discounted offer on your plan. No risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. One subscription can be used across 10 devices. It's perfect for providing that added extra element of security while browsing on public Wi-Fi. And a big thanks as well to fpro.com, the trainer map which can enhance your kids' football skills via their app designed by UEFA coaches. Do click the link for a discount on that up to 60%. So support the podcast and get the very best Christmas present for your budding footballers. Connor, you've mentioned there the kind of the midfield, and that is going to be a huge battle area. I just want to understand how you think Sunderland will approach this game in terms of having the ball. Is it a case that they will sit off and just invite Newcastle on and say, come on, then you unlock us, or will they try and control the game a bit more?
I think that's an interesting question. I think it's hard to know exactly. I saw that Newcastle are, I think, like 9th for possession in the Premier League. Sunderland are second bottom. We've had 42%, I think, is our average. If I was to think about a game that's sort of equivalent to this, we played Bournemouth a few weeks ago, and at the start of the season, I had Bournemouth sort of finishing in the top 6 or 7. I had Newcastle finishing in the top 6 or 7. Bournemouth went 2-0 up against us, kind of just with ridiculous goals. They scored one from the halfway line, and then there was one where one of our players slipped, and the Semenyo got through and they scored. But in that game, we had to have more of the ball, and I was a bit worried. When you go 2-0 down, you do end up with that, but we were able to come back and win it 3-2. But what I'd say is I think that Sunderland are not married to a style of play, and that is probably one of the hardest things about us. I think Newcastle, you can see, pretty much line up in the same way. They've lined up with this 4-3-3 pretty much since Eddie Howe comes in. You can almost pick the Newcastle 11 and how they're going to play, whereas Sunderland are very versatile. We often play a 4-3-3. Sometimes we play a 4-2-3-1, which is probably what we played at the weekend. We've also went with 5 at the back at times, and we swap in games to 5 at the back. Often, if we're winning a game later on, we'll go to 5, or if the manager thinks we don't have defensive control, he'll switch us to a 5. We did that Man United away. So it's really hard to pinpoint exactly how we'll approach it. I would expect the first 20 minutes it'll probably be blood and thunder from both teams. I think Newcastle, when I watch them, they, especially in big games, I watched them against Barcelona earlier this season, they come out really fast and strong in big games, and I would expect them to try that. But I also think because Sunderland are at home, they'll want to come out and play fast and strong as they did against Arsenal. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see who has that control. But one thing with this Sunderland fan base now is that because of the way we went up without possession, I don't know if you watched the playoff games, but we sat in and we frustrated the opposition. We as a fan base are not going to get itchy feet with that. We're not going to be sort of roaring the team to, push and get forward because we understand the plan. And I think in years past, maybe that hasn't been the case. But I would expect that Sunderland, and throughout the game, Sunderland's plan will change. I think there'll be points where they'll sit in and play in a low block, and they'll happily do that. And there'll be points where they'll be really, really aggressive and try and win the ball in the final third. And I think that's what makes them quite interesting to watch, because there is so many different ways for us to play, and we're quite situational in how we tackle things. And especially against Newcastle, who I think are one of the better pressing teams in the Premier League. They are a team that has a lot of quality across the pitch. I talked about long-range shots. If we give Newcastle long-range shots, there's a good chance that they'll score because we've got a lot of players who are good at them. So there's a lot of threats from Newcastle which will play into the manager's thinking as well. But I think it should just be, from a neutral perspective, a very interesting game.
Certainly so. And you've talked a lot about how well Sunderland are doing, and you're very positive about their season in general, and I understand why. But there must be a weakness. There must be a weakness that Eddie Howe can exploit. So are you going to share the secret?
I think in the final third, we're not great. If we're being brutally honest, we don't have great wingers. We haven't settled on a number 9. I think Isidore's done pretty well, Brobby's done pretty well, but we're not amazing, I'd say, in that final third, and we do struggle to carve out a lot of chances. We are pretty low on the XG table and chances created, so that's something. If Newcastle are defensively strong, they'll have a good chance of keeping a clean sheet. Other weaknesses, I would say that we can be guilty, and we have been guilty at times this season, of just having sort of off periods. Against Everton at home, we were awful for the first 30 minutes, and we came back into it, and we did end up getting a draw, but we were really bad. So we do sometimes struggle to put together a full 90 minutes, but as I talked about with basics, it's very difficult to pick out areas of weakness with the Sunderland team, because they do the basics correctly. We do defend pretty well. We are good at set pieces, defending and attacking them. We have things like the long throw that we utilise quite a lot, and we've had quite a lot of success with this season. So there isn't necessarily an individual area of weakness that you'd pick out, but what I would say is that we do give wingers time, and you've got good wingers. We will, because we compact the middle of the pitch, it means that we are more likely to give you time on the wings to exploit us. We don't necessarily let wingers get past us, but we will let you cross balls into the box. And obviously, I know you've got like a 9-foot tall striker, so maybe that's not the greatest answer in the world to doing that. But that's an area that Everton hurt us with, was that they were so good on the wings. Man United hurt us with this as well. They were good on the wings. So it probably is that, but I would caveat that with the fact that the manager will know that Newcastle have very good wingers, and I imagine he'll have a plan for that. But yeah, I think we are a little bit loose on the wings, and I think we can also at times lose control of what we're doing. So I don't know if that they're necessarily, the wings is definitely a weakness. I don't know the control Newcastle can't exploit, whether or not Sunderland have control in the game. But yeah, and also we have, our quality in the squad is not as good as Newcastle's quality, and that is something that is just the reality of when you get newly promoted and can spend. Our squad's got a value of what we've paid of about 200 million quid. So Newcastle's, I imagine, is probably triple that.
Who is the key player that Newcastle need to watch out for? Who's the one that if they stop, it probably stops Sunderland going on to claim victory?
I think it's very easy to look at the midfield, isn't it? I don't know who it was, but I saw a pundit say that this game's going to be won and lost in central midfield, and I think it's very difficult to look past that. Obviously, Sunderland have Granit Xhaka, who's been a revelation since he's come in, and if I've seen like combined 11s, and a lot of the combined 11s are Xhaka, Tonali and Bruno. That seems to be what people seem to think it would be the best midfield trio of the three. Xhaka has been incredible. He's a manager on the pitch. I've not seen a player like him who, our manager has said that he is the manager on the pitch and he dictates what players are. If you watch him off the ball, he has constantly instructions, and he's the heartbeat of the team. If you can stop Granit Xhaka playing, so when we played Man City at the weekend, because we had the situation with the 4 yellow cards with Xhaka and Siddiqui, who was our other central midfielder, they were not able to exert the control on the game that they normally would, because they were so worried about getting booked for this game. They probably shouldn't have played that game, but that's a different question altogether. So that's the main area. If Newcastle can do a job on Granit Xhaka and Noah Siddiqui in centre midfield, then they probably will win the game, and it relies on that. And I think this is really interesting because I've seen this season Bruno and Tonali in particular. I don't know if Joe Linton's going to play because he went off injured, so it might be Miley in there maybe, or Ramsey. I don't know who they'll put in that other centre midfield option, but there's been times this season where I've seen that Newcastle midfield and thought, wow, it's scary. But then there's also times when I watched them against West Ham away and they were bullied in that midfield against Freddie Potts and Matthias Fernandes, who are both the greatest will in the world, are not as good as what Sunderland have. So there are things that I've seen that have worried me. I mean, Bruno, I think, is an unbelievable player. On his day, that there is not many better Premier League players than Bruno Guimaraes. But it's whether or not he turns up. But that's the key battle there. I think there's a much of a muchness. If you look at the defence, I think Newcastle's defence is pretty good. I think Sunderland's defence is pretty good. I think both forward lines are not quite where they'd probably want them to be. I think Newcastle's forward line is better than Sunderland's forward line, but I don't think Newcastle's forward line is where they want it to be right now. I think it's fair to say. But that midfield battle, that's the two areas where both teams are quite strong. And Sunderland will line up with Xhaka, Siddiqui and Lafay. And Xhaka and Siddiqui are the more defensive-minded. Siddiqui's got legs. He's basically, like, I think him and Xhaka have actually ran the most this season of any player in the Premier League. The two of them are like 1 and 2. So they've got a lot of legs in there. And then we have Lafay, who isn't a traditional number 10. He's like a defensive-minded number 10. He's very nitty-gritty in tackles. He does do a lot of tracking, but he's probably the only player we have that can really split defences open on a regular basis. So that'll be our midfield three, and then you compare it with the Newcastle midfield three, where Tonali and Bruno, obviously, they are certainly top 10 midfielders in the Premier League. For me, that's the battle. If Newcastle win that battle, I suspect they'll win the game. If Sunderland win that battle, I suspect they'll win the game.
That is the key battle. But as you've mentioned, there's been plenty of examples this season when Newcastle's world-class midfield is just not showing up, and especially away from home. So Bruno's been brilliant of late. Tonali's been a little bit off the pace, and I think nearly every single Newcastle United fan is wanting Lewis Miley to start on Sunday, although we wouldn't be surprised if Joe Linton is fit that he gets the nod ahead of Lewis Miley. In terms of the player from Newcastle that you fear the most, you've mentioned Bruno there. Is it our captain, or is it someone else that keeps you awake at night?
It probably is Bruno. He's probably the one player I look at and think he's such a good player that he's in. The thing with Bruno Guimaraes is that he's good at everything. He can score goals. He's defensively strong. He's got the highest recoveries, hasn't he, in the Premier League? I mean, he's such a good player that the thing that worries me is that it's him and Xhaka, I feel like, is the battle in the game. And often with Granit Xhaka, he wins that battle. We played against Brentford, say, and they had Jordan Henderson in there, and Xhaka wins the battle, we win the game. And that's the things that I look at. So if Bruno can control that Newcastle midfield and therefore control that game, it's going to be very difficult for Sunderland. So I'd say him. The other player I look at, who I suppose I've got a little bit of fear about, would possibly be Anthony Gordon, and it's not really on his form this season. I know he scored a few penalties, but I don't think he's been great for a while. But I feel like he's the sort of player that probably would thrive in this kind of fixture. So I think Anthony Gordon's one that I'm looking at and thinking, if he has a good game, we know the quality that he has, and yeah, he's probably the only other player that I'm looking at with particular issue. I mean, I talked about the fullbacks at the start. I think the fact that your fullbacks are fit are a problem, but they're not players that you worry about. It's just, it helps your system. Whereas Bruno and Gordon, they can be match winners.
Yeah, indeed. We've got a few Geordies in the side: Lewis Miley, Dan Burn, Jacob Murphy, Gruber, Newcastle United fan. That message will be quite easy to relay in the Newcastle United dressing room. Who's the equivalent from a Sunderland point of view that would be hitting home the message of just how much this means to the city and to the fans?
It's an interesting question because Sunderland have got a lot of academy players sort of in and around it, but I don't think any will start. Patterson is our number 2 goalkeeper. He's been obviously a Sunderland fan growing up. Dan Neil, who was our captain last season, who hasn't, I mean, it's a different conversation, but he hasn't really played at all this season, but he is from Hebburn. He's a Sunderland fan. Chris Rigg, we all know family is Newcastle, but from Hebburn, he's, I think, planted his allegiance in that Sunderland camp now for good. And then we've also got other players. Luke O'Nien suspended. He wouldn't have played anyway, but he's been in, I think he's played 8 years at Sunderland, so he knows what it's about. Dan Ballard, he's been at Sunderland a while. He played in the last derby. And then, of course, you've got players like Xhaka who'll know what it's about. But I don't know how important it is. I think that it's pretty obvious how important the game is, and I suspect that anyone who's from the area or lives in the area, as these players do, will understand its importance. But yeah, I think as well Newcastle's squad hasn't changed that much since they last played one of these games. When we played the Derby game at the Stadium of Light in the FA Cup, the Newcastle squad is largely the same, whereas Sunderland's squad is completely different. It's just totally different. We've got Trey Hume, Ballard are probably the only two that will start who started that game. So yeah, I think it's interesting, but we don't have maybe the same number as Newcastle in terms of ones who'll actually start the game.
I'm a little bit good actually that Luke O'Nien won't come off the bench, because I'm still not over that challenge that he put in on Lewis Miley the last time out. It was a very cowardly challenge. It was quite telling that he did it against a young teenager and not a brute in the middle like a Bruno or Joe Linton. I know Joe Linton actually went off injured, and I was hoping for a bit of retribution, but unfortunately got himself sent off. Maybe he did it on purpose. Who knows? The manager, first time he's faced this derby, obviously the first time Eddie Howe's faced it in the Premier League. Had that FA Cup win, but that was just at kind of different levels, really. How do you think the manager's going to handle the expectation and all that emotion that comes with it? Is he a man who can kind of separate himself from that?
He's very calm, very relaxed, very calm. Isn't what I'd call a typical Sunderland manager, in the sense that normally we enjoy Roy Keane, Mick McCarthy figures who are really, passionate and wear their heart on their sleeve. Our manager, I suspect, will look at this game like every other game. I mean, we see that with his selection last weekend. There was a lot of Sunderland fans that were saying ahead of the Man City game that Xhaka and Siddiqui, because they were on 4 yellow cards, it was absolutely ridiculous to play them in a game that we were likely to lose. He doesn't view it that way. He views it as, no, it's a chance to pick up points. We'll play those players. If they get booked, it is what it is. And I think that can help you, because he isn't going to treat the game differently. Now, I say that, but Sunderland enjoyed success in the derbies. They won 6 in a row, largely because they did treat them differently, and we did approach the games in a different way. So I don't know what is actually the best policy, but I certainly think that our manager is not going to be flummoxed by this. I mean, fundamentally, when you come through the playoffs, they are about as high pressure games as you can play. I mean, the value of the Championship playoff final is the most valuable game in football. There is no game that is worth more financially to a club, and he managed that pressure pretty well and got his substitutions and stuff spot on the day. So I don't think our manager will be flummoxed, and I also don't think for 1 minute that Eddie Howe will be flummoxed by it. And I thought it was quite telling that he played his strongest team in the week and was pretty dismissive of the idea that they might rotate. And I think, that is the right thing to do. As a football club, you can't write off games just because you've got a derby game around the corner, because somebody get injured in training today for both teams, and that changes your plans. So I think our manager will be fine. He'll have a plan for it, and he'll plan for it like he does every single game, and he'll not be worried. I think one thing I would say is the fact that you've played midweek, we've had a week off. Sunderland under Reggie Slippery have really struggled playing 3-game weeks. Generally, when we get a free week into a Saturday, we generally actually pick up a positive result. That's pretty much ran the course from when we were in the Championship as well. So that's something else to think about, because we've obviously had much more preparation than Newcastle had, because Newcastle probably got back early Thursday morning, probably in training today, and then they'll have Saturday, and then it's a game, whereas Sunderland obviously will have had the full week to prepare for the game, which is telling when you've got a manager like Lebris who's a tactician and a coach on the training ground. He'll value that time.
Well, actually, it's interesting you mentioned that, because Eddie Howe's changed things slightly. So they actually flew back straight after the game on Wednesday into training, I believe, on the Thursday, off on the Friday. And he's trying something new to, I guess, just manage the travel and the impact of it. So it's going to be interesting to see how that pays off. Hopefully it is in Newcastle United's favour. And that's the final question, Connor. Give me your score prediction. How is it going to go?
I feel like I shouldn't just sit on the fence, because I think it's boring if I predict a 1-1. I'd say my head is very much saying 1-1 draw, though. I think my heart is saying that it's going to be a 1-goal game either way, and I think Sunderland might maybe nick it 2-1. But I think the reality is it's probably most likely to be a draw. I think that these games often can end up in this way. They can end up being quite cagey affairs. I don't know if this one necessarily will be, but yeah, I'm seeing a draw, but I'll say 2-1 just to really put my neck on the line.
I'm going to go for a 1-1 draw. I agree with you. I think it'll be quite cagey. It's certain parts of the game, but as you said before, first 15, 20 minutes, I think you'll just see challenges, that will just be flying into the opposition.
It'll be a red card.
I was thinking about this. I think potentially, if Sunderland can wind up Bruno in the right way, there's potential there. And look, everybody wants to make themselves a hero, and that's a dangerous place to be. When you're a defender, especially, if you're, the striker's going through and it's a last lunging challenge. It could be one of those. It could be a bust up. I think it will be feisty. I think it will be fiery simply because it's the first one in nearly a decade in the top flight. There's that kind of added extra motivation that a win would take Newcastle ahead of Sunderland as well. So there's loads of little elements to why I think it might be a bit more feisty than if this was kind of the fourth one in the row in the Premier League. So it's going to be such a fascinating game. I think for the neutral, it's going to be fascinating watch. It's going to be a bit nervous for us too, given our allegiances. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it, and fingers crossed for our audience anyway, Connor. It is a Newcastle United victory. Thank you for providing the insight into Sunderland. Thank you to you guys for watching and listening. Do get into the comments and let us know your thoughts on Sunday's game. What will the score be, and anything else you want to chat about? Enjoy the rest of the weekend.